When evaluating a trig function, it often is helpful to know whether our function is going to be positive or negative wherever we're trying to evaluate it. And there's a little trick and mnemonic device that I was taught and I think is quite helpful when trying to figure out whether our function is going to be positive or negative in the quadrant that we're in. So it's this, so it's A, S, T, C. And the way that I was taught to remember this, it's sort of optimistic from a math teacher's point of view, but it's all students take calculus. So again, like I said, a little bit optimistic, but I think it's helpful in remembering which functions are positive in the given quadrants. And the reason, or the way that this comes about has to do with the signs, SIGN signs, of our functions in the quadrants, right? So we know that in the first quadrant, both are positive. Here we have a negative x value and a positive y value, a negative and a negative in the third quadrant, and then a positive and a negative in the fourth quadrant. But again, if you recall, when we're talking about trig functions, we don't want to think about this in terms of x and y, but rather in terms of the cosine of theta and the sine of theta. So the x-coordinate is the cosine, the y-coordinate is the sine. So how does that help us? Well, this tells us that in the first quadrant, all of our functions are positive. The cosine's positive, the sine's positive. The tangent, which is the quotient of sine over cosine, when you divide a positive by a positive, you get a positive, and then all of their reciprocals. So all of our functions are positive in the first quadrant. In the second quadrant, the S is telling us that the sine is positive, and we know that because the sine is the y-coordinate. So the sine is positive. So the sine of theta. Now, since the sine is positive, its reciprocal would also be positive, because taking the reciprocal doesn't change the sign. So the cosecant of theta is positive in that quadrant. All other functions are negative. The cosine is negative, we can see that there. The tangent would be negative, and all of their reciprocals would be negative. In the third quadrant, the t is telling us that our tangent is positive. We know that the tangent is the sine divided by the cosine, so it's the y divided by the x. When you divide a negative by a negative, you get a positive. So our tangent of theta in the third quadrant is positive, and so is its reciprocal, which is the cotangent of theta. So those are positive in the third quadrant. And in the fourth quadrant, it's the c, so this is saying that the cosine of theta is positive. And we know that because it has a positive x value. And then its reciprocal, which is the secant, would also be positive. And then again, these are the only functions that are positive in those three quadrants. All of the others are negative. And then in the first quadrant, they are all positive. And again, to remember this, we say all students take calculus. Hopefully that helps when trying to figure out values of trig functions in the different quadrants.